All right, folks, welcome to our engagement event for this Friday. We're fortunate today to have Eric Kuehnl joining us. So I'd like to take a moment to let Eric introduce himself to you, and then we'll jump into things.
All right, thanks, Frank. Hi, I'm Eric. I am here from the Bay Area, Northern California. I currently am a director of a music technology program at a community college in California called Foothill College. And I think we have the biggest music tech program in California. I've been there for 11 years. And prior to that, I've done a lot of different jobs. Well, my degrees are in music, I should say, first of all. So I have degrees in music. Right out of school, I started working on games back in the early, well, what seems like the early days. I mean, it wasn't really the early days, but early days of kind of modern gaming. The transition happening from 8-bit to 16-bit audio, like a lot of that kind of stuff, and kind of getting us into the modern era. So I worked at a company called Novalogic for a couple of years, worked on a bunch of their games. I don't know if anyone nowadays would know. A franchise called Delta Force that was really big back then, and a bunch of other stuff. Then I moved to the Bay Area and worked as a studio system integrator and kind of trainer, and also was doing a ton of post-production work, independent films, PBS, documentaries, stuff like that. Then I started working at DigiDesign, which is what the Avid Audio department used to be called, working on the training courses that you all know, like the Pro Tools 101 and 110 and all that kind of stuff, reseller training. But then I got tired of that, went back to games. I worked at Sony for a couple of years and worked on a bunch of their big franchises. And then, fast forward, I ended up, once I had kids, it was kind of the freelance life, and all of that was a little bit unpredictable. So, I ended up at Foothill, which has been great. Really, the time has flown by. All during that time, I was also working as a consultant and trainer and doing a lot of this kind of stuff. Traveling around. Frank and I are both master instructors for Avid. There's only maybe 4 of us in North America, right? 4 or 5.
Right.
So anytime schools need their instructors certified, we are the ones who go and do that. And that's kind of how I ended up here, is running the instructor certification programs for your instructors for the 210P and for the S6 console that's down in the studio. So I still do that as, occasionally, especially in the summer and other times, get out to schools and meet people, which is fun, like, to get out, like hang out with colleagues rather than students. Nothing against students. But it is nice to get out and hang out with other instructors and kind of run through some cool stuff. And I always learn stuff too, because everyone comes from these different backgrounds and we're all, pretty well established in our careers.
So we'll dive into a little bit of some of the conversations we've had. It's been great to have Eric here and be able to explore some things that we've been wanting to explore for a long time. But before we get to that, I wanted to just kind of fill in a little bit of your background. If you don't mind, I'll just ask you some questions.
Sure.
So you guys know, I've known Eric for a very long time. I think we've been working together for close to 20 years. And we've been really good friends over the years. As we were working together, we had several opportunities to train together, so we would co-teach some courses. And then in that process, we'd hang out and have dinners on the road and that sort of stuff, go to the movies. Eric loved to go to the movies. And so we just got to be really good friends, and then we've kind of continued that relationship professionally beyond that environment of Avid, and so we work together at my company, Next Point Training. But one of the things that's interesting, you work with somebody for a long time, you don't necessarily know everything about that person's background. So I know a little bit about like where you went to school and what you were studying in school, but tell us a little bit about like why did you choose that college, that pursuit when you were seeking out your college career?
Well, yeah, I grew up in Ohio, actually, which to me is close to here. Like when you live in California, it's like, oh well, yeah, Ohio's right around the corner from South Dakota. Yeah, I know it sounds weird, but when you live like 2,000 miles away. But I grew up in Ohio, and I, studied. I kind of did the traditional piano route. Like I studied classical piano from a young age. But I only stayed in that world until I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. And then I started getting into synthesizers. Actually, throughout that whole time, I was really interested in synthesizers.
So like what year would this be?
So I probably got my first synthesizer in like 1984. I would have been like 10 years old.
So this is when MIDI was
and
a baby.
I didn't know. My very first synthesizer was a Korg Poly 61M. And it was a modified version of the Poly 61 that they had released like a year before. And it was not their first, but one of the first maybe two that they had made with MIDI. So when I bought my first professional synth, it had MIDI. I didn't know it was brand new. Like I learned MIDI like right when I was starting out. I learned about MIDI, and I've always kind of understood MIDI, and I sort of take it for granted because a lot of people struggle with MIDI, but I kind of learned it early on. I didn't know it had just been invented.
So I've got to interrupt there. Yeah. So you started playing on keyboards and MIDI was already a thing. So you just took it for granted from the beginning.
Yeah.
We're a few years apart, and my experience was different, right? I was into music already when MIDI came out, and I remember when MIDI was being introduced, and I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Like, musical instruments that can speak to each other.
Yeah.
I was just floored by that. That was part of what got me interested in music tech in the first place, was just this concept that these, musical instruments could sort of communicate.
Yeah, so they showed that at NAMM, I think in '83 maybe, and it was like a Yamaha synth and I think a Dave Smith, like a sequential synth, which are all back now, which is kind of funny because through all my adult life, like there was no sequential because this company had been sold, and Oberheim and all these iconic companies that are back now, they went away because nobody wanted analog synthesizers in the 80s. They all wanted a DX7, which is kind of funny. Funny little tidbit about that I didn't know until recently. In the 90s, Nine Inch Nails went on tour, and anyone who brought a DX7 for them to smash on stage got into the concert for free.
Well, I didn't have the DX7, but I had the successor.
That's how people later felt about the DX7. But at the time, being able to play like chimey bells and Rhodes and all those kinds of sounds on a synth was a revolutionary thing because everything else was analog.
Do you guys know that reference, DX7? Some of you do? Oh man, when we were that age, that was the synth that everybody had to have.
And it was like, the programming interface was like a pump at a gas station. Like it was like membrane keys, one little numerical display. And right before that, analog synths had a knob for every function, right? So you can see people who saw that transition were like, this thing sounds amazing. And then a few years later, they're like, it's impossible to program.
Yeah, it was like 10,000 button presses.
Yeah. So anyway, fast forward, I played keys, and I started getting into jazz. I was lucky I found an instructor who taught jazz and rock and pop, but I really got into fusion. Fusion was like big at the time. It's funny to look back on it. The things I liked that got me into jazz fusion and synths and like deep into it, and getting deep into theory and harmony and learning modes and all that kind of stuff. It was actually fusion, shredding, like Mahavishnu, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, all this like shredding fusion-y kind of stuff, which hasn't really stood the test of time very well. But then I backed out from that and got into like straight ahead jazz and swing and bop and all that kind of stuff.
So at what point did you get interested in like experimental music?
So when I got a little bit older, I started getting into, and now the music I still really love, as Frank can attest, I got into synth pop and industrial and stuff like that. So I was really into New Order, Depeche Mode, The Cure, Ministry, Skinny Puppy, like all this kind of stuff. And so I started getting samplers and making like weird stuff on the samplers. Even though I was playing in bands, playing like rock and some jazz, I got really into weird sounds and the things you could do on the sampler. And then some cool albums like the first Nine Inch Nails album and a lot of other stuff, they had like these sound designy aspects to them that I found really fascinating. So then, but I wasn't into like Stockhausen and stuff like that, which is, I guess, who would be at that time. Then I went to Oberlin as an undergrad, And that got me like totally hooked on experimental music and electroacoustic music and avant-garde stuff. And my academic expertise, if anything, is probably like mid-20th century electroacoustic music was what I was like crazy into. I actually met Stockhausen when I was in college.
So I'm just trying to envision this. You go to this conservatory college. How did that end up going in that direction?
Well, I mean, I did briefly stop over at another college, and I realized like I just wanted to do music, and I didn't know, I wasn't sure until I first got to college, and then I had like college level music classes in music theory, music history, all that kind of stuff. And I was pretty advanced because I came up playing jazz, right? So like the music theory, I just breezed through it, you know? You start talking about figured bass and stuff, and like the singers, their eyes would just glaze over. And I would be like the one who was like, oh yeah, oh that's like this thing, you know, that's this, you know, we're having to do piano proficiency, fortunately. I mean, I just breezed through all that stuff. I should say by this point I'd been playing bass for about 6 or 8 years too, because keys fell out of fashion in the late 80s. Like hair metal was big, and then like grunge came along, and so my buddy, a good friend of mine, was a guitar player, and he was like, you got to play bass, like bass guitar. I would play in bands where I played left-hand bass on the keyboard for the whole show, like bum 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 on the keyboard. And finally, I was like, yeah, it's not that cool. So I also played bass, and that became my main instrument professionally for all these years. Is bass. I played bass guitar, double bass, and I've gigged playing way more jazz and that kind of stuff over the years. But I've always been doing rock and pop and whatnot. So I got to Oberlin. They have an electronic music program there in the conservatory. One of the earliest programs like that in the U.S. for sure. So my degree was in technology and music and related arts back when that was like not normal, you know. And we were the weird people in the basement of the conservatory, you know. And you still had to do all of the classes like you do here. I still had to do all the music theory, music history, piano proficiency, sight singing, dictation, all that stuff. But then my major classes were in like learning analog synthesis, learning digital synthesis, and a big focus on writing electroacoustic music, right? So like combining traditional acoustic composition with electronics. So I got really into that, which led to that interest in 20th century, like
it seems
classical
to me
experimental.
that was probably a rare thing at a school like that. I mean, where I went to school, we did, you know, I studied some of the same stuff, but it wasn't like a conservatory school. It was just Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and I was taking classes in music, and some of what they offered was courses along those lines, but that had to be rare.
Yeah, I don't think, so my degree was a Bachelor of Music in Electronic and Computer Music from a music conservatory. Like that, I don't know if anyone else had that. I think Oberlin, there may be a few, well, like Cal Arts or Mills or places like that, but I don't think anyone else. So it was pretty unusual, and that was right down the street. Well, it was a few hours from my house, but it felt like it was right down the street. So I did that, and then I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do, and I knew I could never do anything interesting in Ohio. So I only looked at grad schools in California. I was like, that's it. I got to get out of here. I'm not going to be able to do audio engineering, electronic music, you know, game audio, be just like nerd out on like plugins and synthesis.
So did you know at that time, like that's the direction you wanted your career to go in?
I decided when I was like a sophomore in college that somehow I was going to pursue this weird electronic sort of thing, right? Like music technology, electronic music. I didn't know what it all was or where it was all going to go because I was still writing. I would like write a music for a clarinet player, and then I would run them through like a granular synthesis patch that I wrote in the Super Collider or something, right? And that's what everyone was doing at Oberlin. Like I wasn't unique. That was like what we were being taught to do.
Do you still have friends from back in those days? Do you still communicate with anybody from your class?
From Oberlin?
Yeah.
No.
No?
No. Yeah, no. I mean, I played sports too. I had really good friends there, but you know, no one was from Ohio at Oberlin. Like, no one was from Ohio. So it wasn't like there was a local scene. Everyone, when they graduated, went back to the coasts, you know, where everyone was from, you know. And went to work in orchestras. I mean, you have to remember, like Oberlin Conservatory, there's maybe 500 students. 450 of them are performance majors. So they're not going to stay in Ohio.
Yeah.
You know, they have to go back out. And then the composition folks, and a lot of them would become tonemeisters and go into like classical music engineering and stuff like that. And then the ones who are acoustic composers would, of course, try to eke out a living somehow as a composer, maybe conducting, you know, that kind of thing.
So let's jump ahead a little bit because I want to get to some of the stuff that you're doing now.
Yeah.
But so you move to California, you get you get your graduate degree.
Yeah, I went to Cal Arts,
At Cal Arts, and then like straight out of college, what was your next step?
Yeah, so I actually got hired at a game company before I graduated, which is, I mean, things don't really happen this way anymore. There were no programs in game audio. You couldn't even take a class in game audio. It didn't exist. It didn't exist. So I was on a Super Collider chat forum. Yeah, which is just kind of weird and nerdy to just say out loud. I'm in a Super Collider like Usenet group, right? Probably that I logged into from AOL, from my dial-up, beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop, you know, modem.
These guys are going, I don't know what you're talking about.
You know, a little box, you plugged it in, and you plugged it into the phone. Don't pick up the phone, Mom! You know, and it would be like, dee-doo-doo-dee-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. And it would be like, you know, you could send like text in real time. So I'm in a Usenet group, and I'm on there, and I'm posting about Super Collider stuff, you know. And this guy named Tom Hayes, he was on there for some reason, and he was an audio director at a game company that was like a half-hour drive from Cal Arts. And he was like, hey, you should come down and just see what we're doing, you know, because he figured out I was at Cal Arts. And I was like, all right, cool, that sounded awesome. Oh, I should mention I was interning in Hollywood working at film studios, which was amazing, but I didn't know, they weren't like about to offer me a job, right? I was learning stuff, it was really cool, it's all unionized, it was gonna take, they told me the sound designer I worked for, he was like, I can get you in on a film, but it's going to take like a year. And I was finishing a master's degree, right? So I'm like, I can't work at Starbucks for a year. Like I couldn't pay my loans, you know, or whatever. So I was thinking, what am I going to do? And so that was happening in the background, you know. So I meet Tom Hayes, I go out to Novalogic, and they basically offer me a job on the spot.
And so how long did you work there?
So I worked there for like 3 months before I graduated.
Yeah.
I basically didn't go to school for 3 months. But I'd already done my graduation thesis. I was way out ahead of everybody because in my first year, it was a 2-year program, I wrote a ton of music. Every master class, like when guest artists came in at Cal Arts, because I was in composition, we would write music for the guest artists. And I just did it for everyone who came through, singers, like Bang on a Can, one of the avant-garde groups from New York. They were bringing 6 players out, so I wrote a piece for 6 players. And I had all these recorded, and I'd written the scores, so when it was time to turn in my thesis portfolio, like maybe fall of my second year, or December of my second year, I just turned it in. I'm like, here's 20 pieces I wrote, here's the recordings and the video, and they were like, wow. And you know, and then it was like my thesis defense. Like I didn't have to write it's an MFA. I should mention it's a Master of Fine Arts. So it's not like you're writing a research thesis. It was my composition portfolio was the thesis. Right. My thesis defense was like getting coffee with a couple of the faculty and talking about my scores, and they were like, you're good. But I had come through Oberlin, so I had already written tons of music, and so this was just it was like my lifestyle, was like hanging out, writing music. Oh, what do you play, oboe? Great. I would like research oboe, write a piece, program a Super Collider patch, and then put it on a concert, right? So I was way out ahead of everyone because some of the folks who came into Cal Arts MFA composition program had not come from a music undergrad program. So they were having to do remedial history, remedial theory, and since I went to a rigorous program like you all have here, I didn't have to do remedial anything.
Let's fast forward. So you worked for this game company. Yeah. You started 3 months before you graduated. Yeah. And then how long were you there?
So I was there for maybe a year and a half.
And then was it?
And I should mention I shipped 5 games, which is like unheard of. So I came in at a time where I worked on, you know, over the course of the year, I worked on 5 games. They all shipped. When I left, I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of LA. I decided I wasn't going to work in film. and there was not any reason really to be there. And a lot of the hot stuff that was happening, games and indie film and experimental music, was happening in San Francisco. So I'm like, I'd go up there and play gigs, and I knew people there, and so I wanted to move to the Bay Area.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I want to get to what happened next. So you worked at Cutting Edge. Was that immediately following?
Yeah, they like paid for me to move to the Bay Area.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about Cutting Edge and what you did there, just short, so we know kind of what.
Yeah. So I left games. I should also mention I was burnt out on games. Like, it was grueling. This was a 100-person studio. There were 3 people. The sound department was 3 people. And so that meant we were producing dialogue, sound effects, music, cinematic movies and everything. I was scoring movies, you know, and then also doing like thousands and thousands of lines of dialogue recording. And we would put in really long hours. And, you know, so at the end of that time, I was like, I got to take a break. I didn't want to go work at another game company. I was like, I got to take a break from this. So I wanted to move to San Francisco. So on the Digi User Conference, DigiDesign User Conference forums, this is how I get all my jobs. Apparently I get all my jobs on forums. Cutting Edge had posted for a Pro Tools technician to come and work full-time at the company.
So you'd been using Pro Tools at the game company?
I'd owned a Pro Tools rig at Oberlin.
Oh, okay.
And I used Pro Tools at Oberlin. It was pretty new and very expensive. I maxed out a credit card. Why they give a 20-year-old a credit card, I don't know. But I did a summer program in Europe, and they had Pro Tools, and I fell in love with it. So when I got back home, I maxed out a credit card and bought the least expensive Pro Tools rig, which at that time was about $3,000. Because it did not have like a cheap little box. Everything had dedicated DSP, and so I knew it really well, and I built all the Pro Tools rigs at Novalogic, you know, and I'd been teching and kind of helping with Pro Tools at the film studio I worked at. So Cutting Edge, they're like, you're hired. If you want this job. And the funny thing is, the game job, I won't name any numbers here, but the Cutting Edge job was like $20,000 more a year than what I was making working on games. And I didn't even negotiate the salary. It was coming to the Bay Area that just went way, way up, and I was like, whoa, I can pay my student loans, and it won't be like half my take-home income, you know. And so it was a perfect opportunity, and it was the first .com boom in San Francisco. They were doing so much business they couldn't keep up.
So what kind of stuff did you do for Cutting Edge?
So I went there, I built Pro Tools systems, I installed them at all the major, they were the only Pro Tools dealer in the Bay Area. So if you know the Bay Area at all, Skywalker Ranch, American Zoetrope, Princess Coppola's studio, Saul Zaentz was still making films like English Patient, One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nut. So all those post houses, all the music studios, all the bands by that point had Pro Tools rigs. So I was building rigs for Metallica, Santana, Primus, the list just goes on and on and on. They were the only dealer. So I was like, that's what I was doing every day, and it was super cool to go out to all these studios. I'd install the systems, I'd train them on how to use them. That's how I first got into training, other than being like a TA in school. And so, and I was like on the phone with Skywalker Ranch every day, and it was like sink or swim. I did not know. I thought I knew a lot, and I did not know. So like they'd call me up like, the synchronizer's not working on our dub stage where they charge like thousands of dollars an hour on the dub stage. And they're like, yeah, it's not chasing sync from the blah, blah, blah thing. And I'd be like, I don't know what that is. So I'd call up DigiDesign and be like, hey guys, at Skywalker Ranch, like, what do these words mean? And they'd be like, okay, just press this button and do this thing. And eventually I learned how to do all that stuff.
So you kind of had a relationship with people at DigiDesign just through the support tech kind of.
So the resellers we called it like the bat phone. I could dial DigiDesign. The most senior support techs would answer the phone on like one ring and be like, hey Eric, what's going on? You know, early caller ID days, which none of you would probably think about. And they're like, what's up, Eric? And I'm like, hey, Jordan, I'm at Skywalker Ranch and blah, blah, blah. And they'd be like, cool, you need to do this. And I'd be like, okay. Long story short, I got on Frank's brother's radar, who ran the training programs at Avid. Someone left the job. He came and found me at Cutting Edge and was like, how would you like to run reseller training, like dealer training? Come over here. I'm like, that sounds pretty cool. It was a lot more money too. So I was like, that sounds cool. And also I didn't travel Like none of these jobs I had ever traveled. He's like, you're gonna be on the road like, probably like 1 week out of the month. And I'm like, well, where would I be going? And he's like, you'll go to South America and Asia and Europe. And I was like 27. And I was like, yeah, give me that job, But I did love my job at Cutting Edge. I really did.
Yeah.
But this was like, ooh, there were 7 employees. So this was like, yeah, I'm going to do this.
7 employees.
Cutting Edge had 7 employees.
Oh, at
Cutting Edge had 7 employees. So I went to DigiDesign, ran reseller training, traveled all over the world, and of course learned even more about Pro Tools. And that's where I first met Frank. His brother Andy was my boss. We're all about nepotism,
Yeah.
And Frank, he brought Frank in out from not being in the audio world as professionally,
Yeah, at that time.
but was a professional writer. Brought in Frank, I was there, a couple other people, and we built like all the stuff that you now know.
So I want to get into kind of what you're doing now, but I
Yeah.
just want to, before we do that, kind of just jump back a little bit. So you have this experience with building systems, you've got this experience in working on games, and you also have this experience in doing basically post-production for film, for cinema, right, essentially.
I skipped the part where the whole time I worked at Cutting Edge, I worked at a film foundation, and I mixed like 20 films during that time. So that was like evenings and weekends. So when I say like I did all this PBS stuff, I did all these indie films, that was actually while I was at Cutting Edge and DigiDesign, that was what I did evenings and weekends because I wasn't married and didn't have kids, and whatever. So I was taking all these things I was learning, and I built I had a 5.1 system with Genelex and a control surface, and had this crazy studio at my house, and I was working on films that whole time. But that was like nights and weekends, know. So that was super fun to have an application for all this crazy stuff. I was in these studios and seeing them doing this and doing that. I'd go home and build stuff, like build a vocal booth, build a Foley pit, and like do all this stuff for $25 an hour. That's how much I charged people. 25 bucks an hour. So needless to say, I was very busy working on like tons and tons of films at that time. So
all of this background, we don't have to go into all the things that happened in the interim, but all of this background led you into a position where you could run this program at Foothill.
Yeah.
And you're basically taking everything that you have had experience in and bringing it into education and sharing that with your students.
Right.
But you also then do side jobs that are still keeping you fresh in the industry.
Well, and when I was at Digi, I had a bunch of friends at Sony, at the PlayStation group at Sony, and they lured me away from Digi, which I loved that job. I really did, and Andy, I've surrounded, but I could also see like it wasn't going to be that great forever. You know what I mean? Which we won't get into like the business of making audio equipment, but I could kind of see, and I wanted to get back to games, and Sony was like the top. I mean, that was it. So I worked on a ton of huge games at Sony for a couple of years, and then I got laid off. That's how I ended up at Foothill. I got laid off, started freelancing. We've talked about this a lot, that like I started writing books, and I also became a professional video editor during that time because I'd been trained on Media Composer while I was at Avid/DigiDesign, and I'd also worked on all these films as a sound designer. I had a really good sense of like editing video. So that's something, I don't know if we'll get into that, but I just kind of fell into editing video professionally. During the time as a freelancer, I did like 20 different things, I was a proofreader for advertising copy, because they would pay $75 an hour, and it would take me 5 minutes to do the job, right? It'd be like one paragraph of text. And the minimum I would charge them was $75. So it wasn't a ton of money, but it was the easiest job ever to proof some paragraph that was going to be like the ad copy in a magazine for a toilet brush, And they'd be like, I'd make $75. So in a month, I might make $750 proofing ad copy. Then each ad took me 5 minutes, So it was weird, random stuff, and then I ended up at Foothill.
So in a sense, I mean, your entire background, your entire career path has been, you take the skills that you have and you put them to work in all these different areas and find a way to make money, regardless of the circumstance.
Right.
So, and that's, this is what we want for all of our students. that you're armed with all these kind of skills so that whatever circumstance you're in, you can say, oh, I can put that to use here, or I can put that to use over there.
Yeah.
And never end up like going hungry. That's the goal, right?
Well, and this is audio engineering, I would say, especially the music production side of audio engineering, it's very difficult. I mean, there's so much you have to know. And I always say, like, it's kind of unfair. The amount you have to know to like produce records. Ideally you're a musician. You can play instruments. You understand theory and arranging and all that kind of stuff. You have to know audio engineering, like all acoustics and all these concepts. You have to know computers, like really know computers. This is one of the most difficult things to do on a computer, right? So you're doing all that maintenance. Now you have to know networking because it's audio over IP. It goes on and on and on, and it's like kind of unfair. Like video editors, they're like, I know how to press these buttons in Premiere. And then that's it. That's like all they know how to do, And so it's kind of, it's like, what I'm really saying is people who come out of these programs who've really done the work have like an unbelievable skill set that like employers are like bend over backwards. Like my program at Foothill has the highest average salary on graduation, and we train nurses, vet techs, like all the other majors, all the other academic programs, we have the highest salaries after graduation in our whole district. And
you mean from your music tech?
From music tech, yeah. And the funny thing is, maybe it's not funny, but most of those people don't go into jobs that you'd immediately go, oh, that's a music tech job. They go into like if you go to work for Avid or Universal Audio or one of these companies, Dolby in the Bay Area, that's actually not considered a music tech job. You know what the music tech jobs are? Composer, conductor, arranger, and like music studio engineer. That's no one graduating from my program, right? So it's kind of funny. They all get jobs, but that's not the things that the state of California recognizes as being music technology jobs. It's really funny, and then they look at our average salary and they're like in my district, they're like, what is going on here, Like I graduate people who become game developers and stuff like that, not recognized as a music tech job.
Right.
It's really weird. I'm actually really proud of it, though, but it's kind of odd. They're like, where are they going? And sometimes I'm like, I don't know, But again, imagine you graduate here and you go to work for Dolby, and the state of California says like, yeah, that's not a job related to what you studied, And you're like, wait, I learned how to do Dolby Atmos mixing at my college. Yeah, but your program was in music. It's weird, right?
It is weird. And it's also weird because a lot of this technical stuff is housed under music programs.
Right.
When a lot of times it goes way outside of what we consider to be music. I mean, what we're doing, some of it's quite closely related to music, but some of it's not. Video editing isn't really a music production skill.
Right. Well, I think, it's really strange. And none of it surprises me, but then when you get into academia, and you look at like state funding, or different funding sources, stuff, they love to put things in these little like clean little categories. Yeah. And then, same thing at my school with like photography and programs like that. Like no one graduates photography and then becomes like a commercial studio photographer, right? If they get hired at, Google to run video for event production, right? They're not employed in photography because that's a film. They're working in like film and video production. So those things are so dumb, and it's weird we even have to think about it. But
for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. What really matters to me is do you have employable skills, and do you have lots of them? I'm curious to see some examples of stuff that you've worked on, and I'd like to hear a little bit about like the relationship between Pro Tools and other software that you use, or other ways that you integrate the work that you do in Pro Tools with the rest of what's going on out there.
Right. In the music, in of course music production, and in like linear film post-production, I'm mostly only using Pro Tools, right? So it stands alone. It stands as an island. Having said that, like I have an 80s band, and it's we perform with Ableton. Like everything is driven by Ableton. DMX lighting, you know, like you have in here, the video projection, all the patch changes on my keyboards and guitars and vocal presets, harmonizers, all of that is driven by Ableton. But in my regular professional life, Pro Tools really stands as an island because I can do, you know, start to finish projects in music production and in post. In games, on the other hand, the DAW becomes a lot less important. Right, you probably still would choose from a few that are kind of optimal for like sound effects design or like big jobs of dialogue, something like that. But it's not just Pro Tools, and you're not only working in one tool. That's one of the big differences in games, is that the DAW becomes pretty insignificant, and you can kind of choose whatever you like. Pro Tools is big, of course. Reaper is very big in game audio. Nuendo, which is a Cubase, you know, Steinberg, we call it Cubendo because they're basically the same product. So that world, and maybe a little bit of Logic, to a much lesser extent, things like Ableton or FL Studio or something like that, because they're just not they're not good audio editors, you know. But you're doing all that, but that's maybe no more than half the job. That's probably not even half the job. That's probably a third of the job is working in the DAW. The other third of it, another third would be how you're gathering and managing sound assets, like sound librarians, sound effects libraries. I can show Soundly, like that kind of thing. So it's like on the front end, how are you getting sounds into the DAW? Where's that coming from? Recording, you know, libraries, whatever. And then the other kind of final third is game middleware. So you're in usually FMOD or Wise or something like that, and possibly implementing directly in the game engines like Unity or Unreal or that kind of thing. But most games use an audio middleware platform like FMOD. The two big ones are FMOD and Wise with two W's. Wise. So there's all these tools, and actually being like super knowledgeable in your DAW is not as important for games. It's obviously very important for music, and I would say perhaps even more important for post,
right? Because
the things like automation and stuff and session organization are so complex.
So can we drill down into that a little bit?
Yeah.
So most of you, I'm going to guess, are leaning more towards music production at the moment because you're all musicians, right? And that's me too. Like when I go into Pro Tools, most of the time I'm just thinking about music production. Mm-hmm. But post-production is huge. There's probably more jobs in post-production than there are in music production.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you live.
Depends where you live, of course. Yeah, of course. But generally, and then, you know, things like game audio or sound design or things like that are just kind of on the periphery.
Yeah, you'll often hear these terms they'll be like sound for interactive media, because it could be anything, right? You could be just making sound for a website or something. But so you'll hear that. But yeah, generally sound that's going to go into like a gamified thing or something interactive. Yeah, that's really, really big and probably the fastest growing.
Can you give us like a quick demo of like a typical post session in Pro Tools? And then,
sure.
And then if I'd also like to see a demo of some of the stuff you're working on in the games that you're currently involved with.
Okay. Yeah.
So the reason I want to kind of show the post thing is because if you are leaning towards music, like a lot of us who are musicians do, the post workflows can be more complicated, more involved, and you know, Eric can talk about why that world is different from the world of music production when you're working inside of the DAW, and specifically inside of Pro Tools.
Yeah, so this is a typical kind of post session. I do a lot of post for indie stuff, trailers. I do a lot of game post production, which might sound weird, but actually I did a lot of this during my career, where, you know, you probably all know, like, games have a lot of movies, right? They have a lot of cinematics that play. At the beginning of the game, usually there's a big movie that like sets up the context for the game, you know, and then like in between game levels when you're playing like single player Like, there'll be a movie that plays that kind of segues from one game level to another. If you've played Call of Duty, that's kind of like the gold standard for this kind of stuff. So I do a lot of movies that are like 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes. Nowadays, I do that kind of thing almost exclusively, and I rarely do like a 30-minute or a 90-minute project. So this is one I use for training purposes, but it's an ad, and it's about 90 seconds long, and it's a very typical thing that I would get into. You can see everything's organized in folders. I'm not going to get into like stems and all this other stuff, but I'll show you just kind of what my normal session kind of looks like here. So you'll note, by the way, this is one of the first things people ask me about post, is signal flow always goes right to left, which gives people vertigo, like coming from almost any music production scenario. Signal flow always goes right to left. It's just universal in post-production. So what I mean by that is I have all my food groups here. Like, here's dialogue, these are in folders, which makes it really easy to get around. Here's the car, because this one has a car is kind of a prominent element of it. Normally the car would just go in like sound effects. But if it's like a featured element of the film, I might break that out. If weapons are in a featured element, I might break that out. If magic spells are a featured, I might break those things out just for organizational purposes. Then classic categories here like effects, backgrounds, and of course music. Now, most of the things I work on, I get either fully baked stereo music, right, just stereo music mixes, or I might get stems of some kind. But I'm never dealing with multi-track music, typically, in my film mixes. They get mixed separately, whether I'm mixing it or someone else, and then they make their way in as like stereo files or 5.1 files or something like that. So hence, even though I have like 50 tracks in the session, there's 3 music tracks with each one has 1 clip on it, which is a different music cue for the project.
Can you just spend a little time talking about the naming convention?
Yeah, sure, okay, yeah. So post-production people are often working on control surfaces, and so there's these conventions for very terse, very, very, very small names for things. And you'd never, like here's dialogue, and you'll see I really rely on the comments. So you can see the names of the characters in the film, right? And so, but the name of the track is DX01. That means dialogue. In post speak, that means dialogue. So I have a folder of dialogue. So that's that little F, dialogue. Dialogue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And when I was first starting on post, I had a control 24, and the individual channels had 4 character names. Four. So I trained myself like you got to make these names really, really short. Otherwise, if you put like Mortog's Lav Mike or something like that, it would be like MOLLM, Mulm, or something. And you'd be like, even when it's my session, I don't know what that is. So I don't do that. I name them like this. It lays out really cleanly on the control surface. Other thing about post is that if it's a bigger project, you're going to reuse these tracks, right? So like in the next scene, you have 10 dialogue tracks, you're going to use those again in the next scene. So you're not going to name it after like the character or the situation or whatever. So very brief names. So DX for dialogue, FL for Foley, and oops, somehow I'm not scrolling here. FL for Foley. The car is just the car. That's not really an official Hollywood abbreviation. FX, BG's for background ambience, and MX is the abbreviation for music. So you'll hear film people say DXMXFX, dialogue, music, effects. And that's just so they have this very shorthand abbreviation for the different, what we call food groups. I don't know, that's just, I first heard that in the 90s, and everybody uses that term. So by putting these in folders, this really beautifully lays out. On the control surface, it beautifully lays out to use folders like this. It helps me organize. And then in the mix, in the edit window, very elegant to have these things in folders. I can hit Shift F. Oops, I don't know where that came from. I can hit Shift F and see all my dialogue. I can hit Shift F and see all my Foley, my car sounds, and just very quickly navigate through this stuff. Okay, so that's a typical layout for me. This number of tracks, I don't know, maybe there's 30 or 40, 50 tracks, something like that. Pretty typical, but I'm using them, I'm not trying to be efficient. Like this car sound, as you can see, has, it's on screen for maybe 20 seconds, right? And it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, not, did I count that wrong? Nine clips. I put it on 9 tracks. Like, I could have put all these car clips on like two tracks or 3. But we have so many tracks available in Pro Tools that it's like, I'm just going to spread these all out and go. And I'm pulling in clips and I'm just going, you know, I'm just working my way down. And so you hear film sound people say, I had 400 tracks of sound effects. Like literally you'll hear that. And it's like, how many clips were on the average track? Yeah, 1. You know, 2, you know, something like that. So post-production people love to brag about how many tracks there are. The reason I do this is the volume, the plugins, the panning, I don't have to automate, right? I can just set a value for this clip, and then I can set something for this. Maybe this one is far away and I want to run a low-pass filter, right? I could put these on fewer tracks, but then I have to use automation, and you'll learn as you become more advanced in your DAW, you get to an intermediate level and you want to automate everything. Right? And then when you get to become more like, I don't know, expert level, you realize, yeah, you don't want to have to automate stuff. Because you basically handcuff yourself. As soon as you automate on a track, anything else you put on that track, you have to make new automation. So it's way faster to just go bing, 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 bing. Now, if this were a 90-minute film, yeah, this might not be doable. But the track counts are so big now that you can run in all of these DAWs. I mean, some of them are like, there's no cap. There's no limit, right? So anyway, that's why there's like 9 car tracks and there's 9 clips, which is kind of funny to me. But it's convenient. It's really easy. And then once I fold it closed, you know, I'm writing one fader. This fader is all the overall levels of the car. You know, so that's probably what I'm going to end up actually manipulating as I go through and make the mix, you know.
Can we take a listen?
Yeah.
Maybe
yeah,
with,
I don't know how
with
well.
video?
Yeah, is this PG? Yeah, this is the PG version.
We don't have to watch the whole thing.
We don't have to watch. Yeah. So this is a trail. This is a ad that I use in my sound design for picture class. I also use this ad in my video. I teach video editing at my college also, and I use the same materials. This is one of the things for the video editing class. And you can see this is from a company called Edit Stock. If you're curious about video editing and kind of getting pro assets for that, this is a really great company. They have like maybe 100 projects, and they're usually student films and spec ads like this. Spec meaning an ad someone does to like pitch to a company or something like that. But the thing is, they have all the materials. So they give you, when you buy that project from them, they give you all the dailies, every second of footage that was shot on location, right? They give you the script. They give you the lookbook that they use to like design the costumes, right? They give you any graphic elements or whatever. So as a video editor, really, really amazing resource. As a sound person, you just don't need all that stuff, but you can get unrestricted use, you know, of these projects. So anyway, very, very cool company that Avid has worked really closely with. The Media Composer projects, I think they all come from Edit Stock. Yeah. So very, very cool resource. Not quite as helpful for audio, but anyway. I don't know if this is gonna, where are we? Oh, we ended up way back in no man's land here. There we go. Should I run it full screen? I don't know if how well they're gonna hear this. Can you spit your mic in there? I'll turn it up as much as I can.
Incubate. A message from the past.
The dialogue's all over the place.
It's me, Ma. Happy birthday.
So I'll jump ahead.
From the year 2015.
She gets a call from her grandma from 10 years in the past. So the idea of the app is like you can send someone a message to any point in the future. And this is like post-apocalypse. Her grandma calls and she goes, I'm sending this 10 years in the future. You're probably an orthodontist by now. You know, like kiss my grandkids for me. In the meantime, she's like pointing a crossbow at this guy who stole like fuel from them or something. This was a work in progress version, by the way. The dialogue is like all over the place. But I'll just, I don't know if we need to really see the rest of it. They kill the guy and then they, whatever. But they have a conversation about Incubate. They're like laying there like, it's so great. You can get a message from the past, you know, and it's like this post-apocalypse thing. Anyway, apparently it was an app at some point, or was trying to get funding for the app or, you know, something like that. But it's not, I don't think it's anything that you could find now. So yeah, this is just a typical example of something like short 90-second kind of thing. And you know, then this just gets into a dialogue-heavy thing, which is good for people to have to kind of work with dialogue and clean it up. But she looks at her grandma on the phone, and then it goes back to Mad Max, kind of like craziness. Anyway, Incubate, that's the thing. You can find this on Edit Stock if you're curious about it. They don't have many that were like really good for sound design. This was like one of the few. So car chase, a lot of Foley, you know, elements. If you don't, does everyone know what Foley is, pretty much? Yeah, okay, good. So a lot of detailed stuff, and I go through all of this with my students. We design it basically from scratch. We obviously have the production sound, which you could hear in this. Go through, clean that up, add in all the sound effects. The music is just several stereo cues of music that play, like that first one that you heard here. It's like orchestral kind of action suspense thing.
Play the car part again, just so we can kind of listen to the car.
Yeah, I'll solo that up. So this actually came from Pro Sound Effects. Has some specialized libraries. One of them was a Saline Mustang that they had like comprehensive car workup library for this thing, like hundreds of sounds of this one car, which is what you would do if you had a car in a film, like you were working on Fast and Furious or something. You know, you'd get those cars and you would comprehensively record that car so that everything that car was doing in the film you would have in your library, and so you could pull it. So they had a Mustang library. This is obviously not a Mustang, but it worked fine. You know, it's like American muscle car. Sometimes you're just like, it's an American muscle car. And I use this term, thanks for me to say this a million times, see a dog, hear a dog, right? If it's like vaguely the thing that people are expecting to hear, most of the time, you just move on, you know? Rather than like, I'm gonna try to find this GTO with the, you know, armored plates on the side, you know, like whatever. Nah, let's find a muscle car, boom, done. So I got this from Pro Sound Effects, also a great resource for stuff. Let me zoom in on this, and we'll just kind of watch the car. So it's just a long sequence of car revs. Little tip I learned actually from someone who worked on the original Top Gun. When I worked in LA, I knew this woman, Julia Evershade. She was probably in her 50s at the time. She'd been working in film sound in Hollywood for like 30 years. She'd worked on Top Gun, and we were talking one day, and she said, here's the trick. Every time the plane is on screen, it's a flyby. Even if the plane is steady on screen, you know, which would be like, you know, whatever. Every time you see the plane, and you see the plane over here, and it's like you're just looking at them in the cockpit, you know. So I learned this lesson: when you want to make sound design exciting, every single sound is a rev and an acceleration, and you just keep doing that over and over, and it builds the excitement of the scene. So that's what this is. It's like rev, 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 rev. Like every sound is like that, and then that's what makes it build up tension and be exciting. Even though there'd be like a stationary camera next to the car, and you know what it would be. It'd be like, there wouldn't be anything interesting at all. So it's not about realism. And we talk about this in the game audio class, like hyper real. This is hyper real. Like none of this Foley. As soon as you say the word Foley, it doesn't sound real. Like you're just admitting. You're just admitting, like, if I walk along this floor, you're not going to hear my footsteps, right? It's going to be like, you know, in Hollywood, that'll be like, And that's just like every film. You watch like a rom-com or something. It's just, that's the standard level of detail in Hollywood.
Yeah, classic is pulling the sword from the sheath, right?
Yeah. Shwing, and it rings out for like 5 seconds, Okay, anyway, here's the car. Now it's further out. That was all from their library. So I had to sift through it, find this stuff. If I play through it without the music, like I'll unsolo this, but just without the music, you'll hear the other Foley elements. A rattlesnake. And my black hole, I have a reverb on that foot step down that's like a huge reverb, but I don't have my eye lock. So when she steps down, it goes, and that's the kind of stuff you look for as a sound designer. Like, okay, this is kind of like one of the key moments of the, an opportunity for me to do something really cool. She gets out of the car, it's all going really fast, but they show her foot go, and so I put like foot impact on sand, the brace is making some metallic sound, but then I took some subwoofer sub-bass thing and I put a giant reverb on it. And of course, you're not hearing it because it's the one plugin that it was like, you don't have your eye lock. But so this is an example of the kind of stuff that I do a lot. Game movies that I work on are often 30 seconds, a minute, and it'll be about this level of detail, So this would probably take me 2 hours to do. Yeah.
So just for illustration purposes or comparison purposes, you mentioned sort of hyper-real sound. Mm-hmm. What are the other alternatives and where are they used?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about the other thing you'll see in Hollywood would be like more realistic sound. And so if you're looking at something where it's a lot of handheld camera shots, or like what you'd call like cinema verite, just kind of like stuff that seems like it's just unplanned, happening like off the cuff or whatever. Or with the cliche of this is like, I call it like TV news sound. Like you turn on the TV news and they're like, here's, Mary Jones on location in downtown Sioux Falls. And she's like, hey, everybody, and it's like, nobody sweetened that, right? Nobody added stuff to that. So you hear like cars going by and there's like windy, whatever, like that's real audio, right? That's what it would really sound like if you were making it realistic. No Hollywood film ever sounds like that. Documentaries sound like that. Or if you're going for that sound, like a lot of times in films, I always think of Natural Born Killers and some films. I don't know if you all know these films, but Natural Born Killers, they shot like 35 millimeter for most of it. But then when the characters were just interacting with each other, they would shoot Super 8, right? Like super color saturated, low res film. So when they were just like, hanging out, doing something, it was all this handheld Super 8 stuff. And so they made the decision, when it was Super 8 shots, they would have like super low fidelity sound, right? But as soon as, even in the same scene, as soon as it went back to 35 millimeter, then it was like Hollywood style sound. So sometimes you use that as a contrast, right? To like drive home this idea of something being like DIY, like kind of off the cuff kind of thing that's happening. But you'll almost never see that in like a real Hollywood film. They all, like I said, I always think about this, like as soon as you hear Foley, like, oh, it's gonna be, it's a rom-com, but it's gonna sound like Top Gun, because that's how Hollywood operates. Nothing goes out sounding like the TV news, So that I would call just realistic. And then when you get into like fantasy and sci-fi, of course, you're just off into this surreal. It's the most fun stuff to do because when you work on a sci-fi, it also can be the most challenging. When you work on sci-fi and there's like, they have a laser, or like imagine you're Ben Burt and they're the first Star Wars and they have a lightsaber. And they're like, what does this sound like? You know, in some ways, it's the most difficult work to do. But the cool part of it is, there's nothing. I mean, now we have kind of this canon of sci-fi or whatever. But generally speaking, you can make it whatever you want. So that I think of as like surreal. Like there's no. I said like see a dog, hear a dog. Well, that doesn't apply to like the weapons on a spaceship flying around Saturn or something, right? There's no standard. Like it doesn't exist. Or the fact that we even hear sound in space, right? It's like in movies, which, you know, if you go back to 2001 and like the early big sci-fi movies, the space set portions are silent. And it's actually really more impactful in a lot of ways. I don't know if you've all seen 2001. You should at least go and find the climactic like end, not the sci-fi, not the psychedelic scene, but where he shuts down Hal. Just watch that last 5 minutes. He's piloting the ship, and when they show the exteriors, it's silent, you know? And it's actually kind of has more impact than everything being loud all the time.
I'd like to kind of switch gears now and get into a little bit of game audio stuff.
Okay.
But would you say that it's more common in game audio that you're doing that surreal sound more than the hyperreal?
So in my career in general, I would say it's kind of been a mix of the two. Nowadays, actually a lot of stuff I've done over the recent years. Well, no, it's been a mix. It's been a mix. But the last year or so, I've worked mostly on kids' games, and that's one of the things I'm going to show you. I mean, I can't show you the game, but I'll show you the sound design I'm doing. And it's very much just hyper-real, like natural, I mean, real-world sounds, but hyper-real.
So I guess it depends a lot on the game. Because if you're doing Madden NFL, it has to sound like...
It's over the top, but these are just, again, see a dog, hear a dog, but over the top. You know, like, what does it sound like when someone gets tackled? We all know, because the way they broadcast sound in a football game, you know, with parabolic mics and stuff, you hear that stuff really clearly on your TV, even though no one in the stadium can hear any of that, which I always find kind of amusing. I've been to a lot of NFL games over the years, and it's funny. I enjoy going, but it's a much better experience actually watching the game on TV, because you can't hear any of these sounds. A lot of times, there's so many people on the sidelines. Anyone else think of this about football? Like, there's 80 people on each side of the field. Like, the lower your seat is, you can't see anything, right? They play near the sideline, and you're like, I don't know, let's look at the screen. You just end up watching the Jumbotron. Anyway, so a lot of that is real world, but hyper real. That's what I've been doing exclusively pretty much this year. But I worked on some VR games a few years back, and like it was all totally sci-fi, fantasy. Also, a big thing now with gaming is like 8-bit. I'm using this in quotes, like 8-bit. Like the sounds are crunchy, and the music is all like chiptune kind of thing. Like that's been a trend that hopefully is dying. I don't know. I'd rather hear like an orchestral score than like, something from a Commodore 64 from when I was, 9. But it was interesting at the time when that trend kind of changed over and everything went, and even the like graphics and stuff, like Minecraft graphics. My son plays it, and I'm like, like I know it's supposed to be like ironic, but I don't know. It's taking me back to
for you because you lived through it.
I lived through when that was the highest quality of games, and it was always like, oh God. Anyway, let me show some game stuff. I'll kind of show a quick game workflow thing.
I know we're keeping you guys a little longer than I said, but if I want to give these guys a chance to ask questions too.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so let me just quickly I'll show a really quick game workflow. You know what? I'll do something from scratch really fast. So let's say I was going to do footsteps in a game. Okay, so I'll make a footstep Pro Tools session, and I'm going to go to don't save. I'm going to go and grab some footsteps from my sound library. Okay, and I use an application called Soundly to manage my library, and also they have a huge cloud library that you get with your subscription. It's really cool. I've been talking with Peter about this. So I'd go into my sound librarian and I'd be like, footsteps on dirt. Footsteps dirt. A bunch of stuff comes up from my library, and then as I get down into the Soundly library, you'll hear. Go ahead. That's what I was looking for. Okay, so you have that. I'll take this clip, and I will spot it into Pro Tools. So I hit the little Pro Tools button, sends it to Pro Tools. Yeah. There it is. So now it went from my library into, I can drag and drop too if I have like, oh, I wanted to go over here, whatever. I just spotted it to the selection. So here's my footsteps. We'll take 5, sure. So I'm gonna start editing these. I'll zoom in on this one, and tab to transients I use a lot. I'm gonna do this really kind of roughly just to make it go fast. So I'd listen to that one. Yeah, so probably about there I can cut it. I'll tab up to this one, trim that. Yeah, probably around there. Sure. Oops, maybe there. Cool. Okay, so I've got 5 steps. So I can, what? Keyword Maestro, get out of the way. Cool. So then what I'd probably do with these, I would add some really quick fades here just to do a little housekeeping. I'll put like a 3 millisecond fade on the front, and it could be longer. It could be like maybe 50 milliseconds on the back. I don't really care about the tail end of it so much. So they've got really quick fades. Okay, great. So I'm going to select these, and the minimum mastering sort of process I'm going to possibly do on this would be to run a limiter and just get them up to like, a meaningful level. So I'll just keep it simple. I'll use something that you all have like Maxim.
So when you say a meaningful level, what do you mean by that?
Full scale. Like these game audio assets, when they go from Pro Tools into like the middleware, which I'm going to show, full scale and plus a few extra dB, but not crushed. We're not talking like, Metallica here. So I'm going to set my ceiling to like -1. Oops. Minus 0.1. Okay. And then the threshold I'll adjust. So as I preview these, what I'm looking for is a tiny bit of attenuation over here, maybe 1 or 2 dB. So they will be plateaued. They will be kind of like flat topped like a little bit, but I'm not trying to make them like crunchy. So I'll just keep going down. I can see from the yellow, this is maybe hard to see where you are. That's where the peak is now. So I'm gonna go a couple dB below that, and we'll preview this. Good enough. Good enough. Render that out.
Now you used Audio Suite for that.
Game audio, people love Audio Suite because it's batch. It's a quick way to batch stuff. You could use, if you have a complex chain and you want to do it in real time, you just commit, right? That's definitely another way to do this.
So why is it important to have that in the audio instead of you just put it on the track?
In FMOD?
I'm just for,
But that's what you're asking me? Like,
yeah,
why not?
Why not just leave the...
Yeah, you want these, you really want to bring things in at maximum volume, but the main thing is consistency. All the footsteps I'm going to limit in about this way. So they'll be punchy, they'll go in. I might do EQ or something, I'm just not going to do that right now. I also sometimes will add a little distortion. If you've never used something like Decapitator by Sound Toys or something, man, I put that on everything. It's like, I don't know. It's Tabasco. It's like Tabasco. I put it on everything to make it a little bit crunchy. So I'm going to rename these. I'll use auto rename. I don't need the more complex batch rename. And I'm going to do like Foley because they're Foley elements. I'll do footsteps. Sometimes you do FFS, Foley footsteps, but I'll just spell it out. Footsteps. Was this sand or dirt? I can't remember. Sand. Yeah. Dirt. All right. Dirt. Dash. Start on number 1, number of places 2. I always pad it with another 0, with a 0, in case I end up with, oh, that's weird. I was not paying attention. Yeah. .L. What? I might have to do a more, whatever. We'll leave it. So there they are. Those are basically finished. Again, I do a little more signal processing. I'd edit them a little more carefully. And potentially, I'd add more layers. I'd add like a cloth layer. I'd add maybe some jingle, like some chains or some other, element or whatever. But we'll just do it like this so I can show you how this gets implemented in the game. So I'm going to export these using export clips as files. I'll throw that into a desktop folder, whatever, footsteps. It's already there. Fully footsteps, FFS. There you go. And that's it. That's that. I mean, again, I might add another layer. I might not. Depends. I'll show you in the game. The other thing is I might have footsteps for different surfaces, which I'll show you. I just wanted to kind of show you the process. But then I might have cloth movement that's the same for all the footsteps. So the footstep impact is going to be specific to the surface, but the cloth movement is going to be the same for all of them. So I'm not going to redo that. I'm going to be able to play that in the game so that it changes the impact surface, but the cloth is always the same, right? Or the other, if you had another element of some kind, it could be the same. Let me think if there's anything else we're showing in Pro Tools. This might actually be the amount of work I would do in Pro Tools for a particular task. I'd be like, boom, those sound good. If they're really good sounds from the library, it's like that is probably the most important thing. Like, is it the right sound? You could do some manipulation on these footsteps a little bit, but how much? Like, how much could you really fundamentally change these footsteps? It'd be better if you needed some other kind of footstep to just find something else. Fortunately, I have tons of footsteps in my library, so I can pretty much always find the right thing. Okay, we're going to move to FMOD unless you have any.
No, I was just going to ask you, do you frequently find yourself recording your own assets when you can't find stuff that you need?
Only if I can't find something. Usually there's not time to record, I certainly don't record everything. I mean, no way. There's definitely not time for that. If I can't find something, if the timing is very specific and I can't edit something to match the timing that I have, I will record. I always have a mic set up in my studio, so certain kinds of things I'll do a lot of recording. Something like footsteps. I mean, and if you think about games, it's like explosions. Like I can't record weapons. Like I can't. I've done actually a lot of weapon recording over the years, but like an average person can't really go out and do weapon recording. I'll have to tell you that story another time. But I've done like big budget weapon recordings out at gun ranges, out in the desert and stuff like that. It's fun to do once, for sure. It was fun the first time I did it, and then after that it was like, no. But those are all in libraries. By the way, there was a Kickstarter many years ago for a free weapons library because a guy said, you know what, I'm going to get the community to fund me going out and doing a gun shoot, right? And then I'm going to make it free. I'm going to make it public domain. So you can find, in fact, in Soundly, check this out, right here, the free firearm library, the free medieval weapons library. This is some guy did a Kickstarter, funded all this, and then just put it out for the community. And his logic was, does the world need more AK-47 recordings? Does the world need more AR-15 recordings? I mean, why should independent small budget games have to either record this stuff or pay money for these sounds that have been recorded like thousands of times, So that was pretty cool. So you can actually link to these in Soundly's cloud library, amongst many other things. So that's kind of neat. Anyway, we're done with Pro Tools. I'm going to jump out of there, and I'll show you some middleware stuff, which is probably, hopefully, something you'll find interesting. So I'm going to bring up my browser in here. I'm inside a middleware platform called FMOD, and this is a game I've been working on. I'm still working on. But let's make a new event, and I'm going to call this Footsteps. And I'll just show you how cool. I mean, these audio middleware applications are so cool. So I'll go to my FFS, Fully Footsteps. There they are. Okay, I'll go to Assets, and maybe, I think, will it keep the folder hierarchy? I can't remember. Yeah, it does. So here's the Fully Footsteps now in FMOD. Kind of looks like a DAW, kind of acts like a DAW. I can play them here. I can see if they loop. I don't want these to loop, but I can see if they loop. That's like bad footsteps in a game right there. Like, da. Okay, so check this out. Here's my event, and I'll make a new track. And again, it looks like a DAW. And watch this. I'll grab these 5 footsteps. I'll drag them onto the track in FMOD. I'll move them over. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And now watch this. That's footsteps in a game right there. I can make this loop if I want, just to try it out.
So can you explain what we're seeing and hearing?
Yeah, I will in a second. Randomizing between those 5 sounds. I didn't have to do anything to make that happen. Just drag multiple clips onto that track simultaneously. That's it. Okay, so what's happening here is this is called a trigger region. And by the way, you can see that like this one right here, I probably should have edited a little closer to the attack transient so that it would match up well with the others. But the question is it adding variety or is it standing out? So that it's obvious when that one's repeating. Sometimes you have one that goes like squeak, and then so you'll throw it in there and be like, oh yeah. So that's number 2. I just want to show you quickly, I can come in here and just delete that out. So now it's randomizing between the other 4. Sometimes you'll do that. You'll bring a bunch in and it'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, I can hear when that one hits, I can hear it every time. That's better. They're kind of more random. So what it's doing is it put the 4 wave files down here in this multi. This is called a multi-instrument. And it puts them in there, and it automatically will shuffle through these. Okay, I don't have to tell it to do anything. When the game says, hey, FMOD, play a footstep on dirt, FMOD goes, hang on, FMOD goes. And then the game says, play another footstep on dirt, and FMOD goes, right? And so the game has no idea what is happening inside this event. It just knows play dirt step. I'll call it dirt step, dirt step, dirt step, dirt step, dirt step. And FMOD goes, all right, check this out. So it's 2 lines of code in the game. 2 lines of code will play this event, this FMOD event. Okay, if you implement these sounds directly in like Unity, you would have to write the code to randomize this, right? You would have to potentially write code that caps the polyphony, so not too many footsteps play simultaneously. You'd have to write the code that varies the pitch, like all of those things. With middleware, I can throw it in here, set it up in 1 minute, and then the dev puts the 2 lines of code, one to declare what event to play, and the other one to play the event, right? That's it. And so it saves everybody time. It allows a sound designer to be more creative and make changes like, well, now I want it to randomize between 10 footsteps. I just throw 10 footsteps in here. The devs don't even know that I did that. Do you see what I mean? I mean that in a good way. They don't even know. They don't even have to be concerned. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to randomize the pitch. Watch this. It doesn't time correct, so their times are going to be like, whoa, like all, like, or they'll be like beep, beep, So by default, it doesn't time correct. But I made it plus or minus 2 octaves just to make it extreme. So check this out. Oh, let me turn the looping back on. You'd have to write that in Unity or Unreal or whatever. You'd have to set that up. I mean, I'm not trying to say it's super complicated, but you would have to do that work. You'd have to communicate with the developer. Hey, I want to be able to randomize this thing, whatever. In this, I can say, yeah, I want pitch randomization. Let's do 3 semitones. Oops, 3. I need more layers. So if we added cloth into this, if we added some other things into this, right, then it would start to be more random because you wouldn't just really clearly hear beep, boop, boom, gom, beep, boom, boom, gom, and you'll sometimes get like bing, gom, bing, gom, bing, gom. I mean, I'm making the sound of a boop, but it's your ear will pick this up when there's only 4. So if you add another layer, this is the key to randomization. You add another layer. Let me see. I have fully in here. I have some footsteps. There's some block steps. I can't remember if I have any cloth. I don't have cloth in here, but anyway, that's a super basic event in FMOD. I could put this in the game, 2 lines of code, and now you have really nice, these were recorded like 96K, 24-bit, super modern, clear, punchy steps. I put them in here. It takes me a couple of minutes to set it up. I send this over to the dev team, and this gets sent out to everyone who's building the game, like 5 minutes. Well, it depends on when they download a new build, but an hour later, everyone on the team is hearing my new footsteps. So that's a very typical task that I would do. This is a little simplified.
So let's stop there because I want to allow time for questions. But as we field questions, you can continue to demonstrate or expand on that. So
let me just show one quick thing. This is the actual footstep event from the game. And you can see changing text, changing surface materials. So here's grass. Here's sand. Here's dirt. Here's stone, footsteps on stone. Gravel. Bricks. You get the idea. It goes on and on and on. Wood. Glass. It's actually footsteps on glass, which is kind of weird. Stepping on a bush. Metal. So I had to build, 17 different surfaces or something for this. So this is the actual footstep event that plays in the game of this game I'm working on. And you have all the jumps that are specific to the textures, the landing when you jump that's specific to each of those, and so on. So that's what it looks like when it finally goes in the game.
Yeah, it's super interesting. To me, I hadn't seen this before. Eric showing it to us, earlier yesterday, I think, was the first time he showed it to us. And all of a sudden, I now realize something about game audio that I didn't know before. It's really fascinating to see how it comes together. But this is middleware that you don't have to use, but simplifies the process. So anyway, you've heard a lot at this point. What questions do you have?
Yeah.
I just have a question though on FMOD right now. So like the pacing of the steps on all the different surfaces you played, they were like different. So with the game developer, when you sent those files over, would FMOD so say if in your game, if you're moving faster, does FMOD automate that? Or does
No. So the steps have a certain, there might be kind of an almost like sort of latency to the steps. Mm-hmm. But remember, every step is being triggered by the character's foot touching the ground. Mm-hmm. So it might have this softer kind of impact. Yeah. But if the player runs really fast, by the way, this is cutting off each time I hit return. In the game, it doesn't do that. The step will ring out, and that's what I was saying about controlling polyphony, right? If the player's running really fast, you could have potentially 6 or 8 footsteps that are all still ringing out, and it drives up the CPU usage. So you might say once the third one is sounding, just cut the oldest one off, like a synthesizer does, right? So yeah, I know what you're saying. Like these feel a little soft. The timing is a little soft, but the game would still go. So ultimately, the player would never hear that is like a softer kind of timing than like, which we hear is instant response. The player wouldn't know. I would be varying by like a frame, if you know what I mean, like in the gameplay. Yeah, it's a great question though. So they're not intelligently varying this, like the timing of these, but it's being triggered for each individual step. So your eyes, playing the game, you would never think like, oh, I jumped onto grass and now it's out of sync. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? No, like a player wouldn't really make that connection, I think, yeah. Unless there was too much lag, then obviously, the other thing is.
That would have to do with trimming those assets properly. So
these are edited pretty carefully, but there's some variability, as you can see. And part of it is sometimes the impact has no real sound, and it's like a scuff or something that gives it character. Like when you walk on brick, it doesn't go like bam, bam, bam. It's like it's the after sound. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's the foot like coming to rest that's making the sound. But it works really well. I've played all of these in the game, and they work great in the game. Yeah, good question though, yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Do you use FMOD? Have you used Wise before?
Yeah.
Do you prefer FMOD over Wise?
Yeah. Wise, I feel like I'm working in Excel. Okay. Yeah, and it's way more powerful. It's much more powerful as a middleware tool, for sure. But on simpler games, like this kids game, you're seeing the level of complexity. is not crazy, right? Even though these individual vents take a lot of time to build out, like all these footsteps, all these surfaces. The blocks, like making and destroying these blocks, they kind of sound like the footsteps, but they're different. These are actually things being dropped onto stuff. A lot more debris because it's not someone walking along, it's a block being constructed like Minecraft, right? So, by the way, they have a second layer in here. They all play the same subwoofer sweetener, which you can't hear on my laptop. So they all play the same bass sweetener layered in with the randomized material, right? So the blocks destroy, same thing. Where is I going with this? This is so easy to do in FMOD. It makes it just like working in a DAW. It's really intuitive. It feels more creative to me. Wise is absolutely more powerful. There's no question. It's been around longer. It's a much more sophisticated, but I can work faster in FMOD. And one of the main things about this, I'm a contractor on this game. I don't work at this game studio. When I leave, I have to teach someone there how to use this. I could never teach some random person how to use Wise, like who wasn't an audio person. I mean, there is no way. It's just the learning curve is really steep, So I teach it. I mean, I do teach Wise. I teach it at my school and other schools that I've taught at. But my preference is definitely FMOD. But I wouldn't use it if I were like on if I were an employee of the studio and I were working on like a AAA title, we'd be using Wise. Yeah. But for mobile, for indie games, and for just simple games, I would definitely prefer FMOD. I mean,
I have another question for you, just in the interest of time.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you had to say, like, what are 3 or 4 things that you would say that a student who is in our program should think about in order to work in sound design, film, or games?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that you're all not going to want to hear, but that I realized when I lived in Ohio, was that getting your foot in the door in this business requires you to be close to where the business is. I mean, that's just a reality. If you want to work on major label records as a studio engineer, you got to go to LA or Nashville. Otherwise, the chance that you're going to break in becomes just so slim. If you want to produce yourself as an independent artist, you can be anywhere. I mean, that doesn't matter anymore, right? It really doesn't matter. YouTube, Spotify, all these things, doesn't make any difference. But when you're a person, when you're in a service industry, like being an audio engineer, or being a composer, arranger, orchestrator, like that kind of thing, when you're starting off, it matters where you are. I mean, it really does. So what I would say is figure out what you want to do and figure out where that business is. And then you don't have to stay there. But that's your best shot at breaking into that industry. It's like if you told me like, well, I want to work for a tech startup. I'd be like, well, go get a studio apartment in Palo Alto, because there's going to be an unlimited number of opportunities, right? Once you have even maybe one job on your resume, right? Maybe 2, you could leave. You could go anywhere because people will find you based on the work that you've done. But when your resume has no professional work on it or like high-level professional work, the networking is so key. Who you know and who you're meeting is so important that I think you have to just accept like, all right, I'm going to probably have to relocate if I want to break in a creative field, right? Because the face-to-face networking or just being geographically close, I mean, things aren't going to stay as remote as they have been for forever. So I think that's a really important thing. And when I was in Ohio and I was looking around, there's more stuff now, don't get me wrong. Definitely more opportunity in Ohio than there was in the 90s because so much of this stuff has spread around. But in a creative field, I think you got to go where the work is and make a plan for that for like a few years. And then you can definitely leave. There's no question that you can leave,
What are your thoughts around audio people learning video production?
Oh, yeah,
like
yeah. I would say if you're looking to be a freelance creative, you have to learn to edit video. You have to. There's more work. It pays more. The individual relationships, like when you have a client, the amount of work they're hiring you to do is longer. When I used to work on indie films, they'd come to me with a budget, and I could justify spending 2 weeks maybe on their film, right? Which is usually enough to do a pretty good job, a job that I was proud of anyway. They had worked with that video editor for like 4 months. And also their rate was certainly higher than mine, right? So if you think about it, how many clients does the freelance video editor need to be basically employed full time? Like in a given year, 4. In the course of their career, 8, right? Because people keep making films, you know? So that person, even though that filmmaker didn't have very much money, that person would spend the money on the video editing, you know? And I've seen that for many, many, many years. And it's true in the corporate world, it's true in the broadcast world, or wherever you go. There's more work for video, and it pays more. And then the thing you can try to do is like do some of that, fill in when maybe you're not busy with whether it's composing, arranging, performing, sound design, whatever. You could fill in with that work, and then you can upsell those people on all those other skills that you have. Like I tell the story all the time, back in the early 2000s when I was doing all these independent films, I learned how to author DVDs because that's what everybody wanted. So every single client, I would get like 2 or 3 more days with them to author the DVD of their movie, right? Make a little menu system, put some credits in there, maybe a couple behind the scenes, little clips, like an interview with them. I wasn't making this stuff, I was just putting it in there. But also making sure that the stereo and surround mixes that I had made for them were properly implemented in the DVD, like all that kind of stuff. I'd get a few extra days of time with that client. I mean, I was probably getting 10 or 20% more money from that client to do that one little thing that, by the way, I learned how to do in like no more than 1 day.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for us, that 10 or 20% is oftentimes what keeps food on the table. You know, it's like sometimes it's slim pickings. So to get from one job to the next, those picking up a little bit extra here and there really makes a difference.
I mean, if you can get more work from the same number of clients, I mean, that's pretty key.
I've got one more question for you, but I want to just check with everybody.
I have one question, just kind of back to your point on like the proximity thing of the job you want. So our major here that has a internship element, do you think that like using that is kind of like the first step to get the job there, so you don't have to just be like, well, I'm gonna go get my studio apartment and hope that I get a job there then?
Yeah. I think interning if you have like really ready-made internships around here that seem to suit your goals, then I think that's great. That's amazing.
I'm
you
just
know?
saying, like,
But
our internship, most people that are doing it are going elsewhere.
oh, they are. Okay. Yeah. No, that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, being able to go and work where you maybe aren't as worried about making money, and you're able to go and hopefully make those connections and network and impress some people. Doesn't mean that particular internship will turn into a job, right? But yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the right time to do it. I mean, when I was interning in Hollywood, that didn't really directly get me the game job that I got, but it certainly didn't hurt. Like that guy knew that I was going out in the desert and recording guns. And that I was like, I know that sounds weird, right? But like Tom Hayes, who hired me, like he knew that I was working on these blockbuster Hollywood films, you know? That I probably would have gotten the job anyway because the serendipity of like how he met me and everything. But he was like, yeah, this is a serious person. And then we would also end up talking about Stockhausen or something. You know what I mean? Because he was a curious guy who was a musician and, you know, composer and all that stuff too.
But I think that comes back down to, you know, making connections and then getting something out of your connections. The people that you meet along your journey, you know, you called it serendipity, but it's not just serendipity. It's putting yourself out there so those serendipitous things can happen.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's like the sports, I don't know who, you know, some famous Yogi Berra. It's like you make your own luck, right? Like you can definitely set yourself up to be lucky. But I think in a creative field, it's the breaking in is the hard part. I mean, that's it. That any field that's ostensibly like creative, there's a lot of people who want to do it, right? So it's definitely hard to break in. Once you have any, I would say, once you have any like major professional accomplishment, where you went to school, nobody cares, right? And possibly even nowadays where you live, nobody cares, you know? Unless it's like a union film sound editing job in Hollywood, you know what I mean? Which is probably not where most of you will end up. Hopefully some of you do, you know? But once you have any major accomplishments on your resume, people will find you. More importantly, when you then go to speak to people and you're interested in working for them, they will take you seriously, you know? It's always the joke about when you want to, like you go to NAMM, the big music and instrument show, and people are like, I want to be endorsed by, you know, Fender. And it's like, you know that's, the endorsement is you endorsing Fender. You're an endorser of Fender. They're not an endorser of you. So think about that for a second. Who does Fender want endorsing them? Not someone who is not in a known band, you know, like, and they always say, like, if you go and you're like, I'm the bass player for, I don't know, I can't think of any popular bands. Like, I play bass in so-and-so famous person's band. They'll be like, let's talk about your signature model. Do you know what I mean? Otherwise, they're like, get out of here, kid. Like, we don't have time for this, you know? And I feel like it's all about your resume. It's like if you have serious accomplishments on your resume, then people will want to work with you, even if it's maybe not even all that justified. Like maybe you worked on this thing and you were like horrible to work with. I mean, that happens, that does happen, you know? But people will look at your resume and like people still call me up for game jobs like out of the blue. And
Even
like,
though he was horrible. You know?
I was terrible. I was the worst. No, but they'll call me up and be like, we're looking for an audio director. And I'm like, dude, I've been a full-time faculty person out of college for 11 years. Like, I'm not leaving this job to go back to like, you know, working really hard and having a very stressful job, you know, working on games. It's definitely a younger person's, like, you know, career, unless you can get to the level of being a director, you know, audio director or something like that. I mean, even like a VP or something. So yeah, but they still call me up and I'm like, did you look at when the last time I worked on a AAA title was? Because it was 2010, you know? And they're like, yeah, whatever. Because they know that you've done it and you've done it at that level. And hopefully if you've worked on games that were really cool, then people will like come and find you. And you know, so I think that's really important, is getting out there to where people are, where you can network. When like you go to a networking event, the people you want to work with are there. One extra little bonus piece of advice, don't hang out with other audio people. You'll never find a job that way. They're looking for work too. So don't hang out with audio people. Hang out with the people who work in a field that might want to hire you. Like, I learned that early on in my career. I'd go to the like game sound designer hangout and everybody's like, hey, can you hire me? No, can you hire me? No, can you hire, you know, like no one there is handing out work, right? Go to the game jam, right? Or go to like hang out with people who make films, you know? And they'll be like, can you do the sound design for my film, right? Another sound designer is never gonna ask you to like, you know, so like that's a big piece of advice I learned over the years. I tell all my students, like, don't hang out with other audio people. If you're a composer, don't hang out with other composers, you know? Like, that's what you do, like, for fun, but that's not networking, you know? You gotta hang out with the people who might hire you. And that's going to, like, the Game Developer Conference, or going, you know, it's not going to, like, NAMM is not the place to get hired to work on games, you know, where all the other game sound designers are drooling over the latest plugins or something, you know? You got to go to where like people are making games, you know. Or people are if you want to work on films, find people who are making films, not composers, not sound designers, but the people who actually make films. And in anywhere you go, right here in Sioux Falls, there's some group of people hanging out who make films.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
Well, let's wrap things up. Because I know it's getting late, and we've kept you guys here for a long time. Any other questions from you all?
you just totally discouraged more questions.
Yeah, exactly. Let's wrap this up. Any more
You're like,
questions?
we're leaving.
Okay, good.
Does anyone?
Now, so the last thing I just wanted to touch on is, what's your opinion about other certifications besides what we're doing here? You know, obviously we're doing all the Avid certifications, but certifications from other companies. You know.
Yeah. I would definitely do WISE certification. That's the only like middleware. It's the materials are free online. The exam does cost $200, which is crazy, but all the materials are free. And that's the only current manufacturer like created middleware certification. So if you're interested in games, definitely do WISE, definitely do Pro Tools. There aren't
What
really
about just audio in general?
I was going to say do the Audinate, do the Dante certifications. In the Bay Area, I have good friends who work with companies that place like event production and audio and sound design and video editing people all throughout the Bay Area. They're always calling me up, hey, do you have a student who has event production experience and knows Dante? And I'm always like, no, because we don't teach event production at my school. You know, we don't have a music conservatory. It's purely an audio engineering, program. So event production and audio over IP, there's tons. Even I don't care where you are, there is work for that. And it's not like AV Tech. Those are good jobs. Like you can go and set up the projector and the PA in a hotel conference room, right? And that's a good entry-level job. But a job that's like definitely a big leap above that is doing like event production with audio over IP. If you know how to operate a camera too, like that kind of stuff, it seems like there's a shortage of people who know how to do that stuff. And for all of you, this is like super easy stuff. You've done all the hard work. Like being a musician, being in an audio engineering program, music tech program, it's like you can do the Audinate Level 1 training in 2 hours for free online. And you can say Dante certified. You can put that on your LinkedIn. By the way, get on LinkedIn. You don't get hired on TikTok. Get on LinkedIn, build a profile, start putting these certifications on there. But so I would say definitely do the Dante Level 1. Even the Level 2 and 3 if you want, but it starts to go off into the weeds of crazy like networking infrastructure and stuff that you don't need to know just to go in like a music or audio setting to manage a Dante network. They'd hire other people for the crazy, other stuff. But that one I get asked about. People actually come and ask me, do they have Dante certification?
Awesome.
So that's a big one. And then do all the Pro Tools stuff that you can. That's really the only recognized audio like DAW certification. I mean, we're biased, but it's just a fact that it's really like the only one. So sometimes like with WISE, it's like you want to go get that certification, it's the only one. So there's no question like which one do you do, So yeah, I would definitely do all of that. All those things will help you get that first job. And then as soon as you have the first job, none of that stuff matters anymore, and people will just hire you based on the jobs you've done,
All right. Well, we should wrap things up. But thanks so much for spending so much of your time with us here, and hopefully you all have appreciated this. Let's give Eric a round of applause.
Thanks.